Usually, by this stage in a project, I have a clear idea of what I want to do for a base. For this project, I don't. Welcome back to the bench. I'm Paul, and today we're going to figure out what to do with this 1/72 scale Revell Nashorn at Kharkov. Stuck for ideas and not being immediately grabbed by any reference images I found, I decided to go for a bit of an unusual source of inspiration for us modelers. I launched the video game Hell Let Loose. I loaded up the Kharkov map and was quickly standing on the snowy, frozen ground outside Belgorod in March 1943. What I really enjoyed were all of the wooden fences that defined the hamlets and villages around hotspots on the map. These garden and roadside boundaries still suggested Eastern Front to me, but are a more subtle and manageable element for a project that I didn't want to turn into a diorama. So, back to the bench it was, and my first step was to mark out some ditches on either side of the road, using the model as a guide. Once I've removed the model, I used the magic of editing to cut out the ditches, and so we were ready for texturing. I applied a very thick layer of AK's dark earth along the road, where the wet ground was liable to get churned up. I apply it thick so that we're able to make some imprints in it and suggest a super rough surface. We can drag the paintbrush then from edge to edge to create vehicle tracks from cars, tanks, motorbikes or carts. I can also use the Nashorn as a stamp to leave some tracks from where it came from, onto the fence, and I got some of the ice cream tub styrene that we rebuilt the side armour on the Nashorn from 2 episodes ago, and I taped a long strip to my cutting mat to make a horizontal support. Then I cut a whole load of short strips to make up the vertical fencing. I didn't measure these or use a ruler. Some variation in size and shape will only add to the slapped up aesthetic that we're going for. Once I had a big old pile, I mixed it up so the pieces were truly random, and I began to glue them to the rail from earlier one by one. Gaps, odd angles, different heights are all intentional here and will add realism and interest to this little part of our base. Using extra thin glue on the long strip had the added benefit of sticking it to my cutting mat. Oops. Once I had a decent length of fence, I sized it up to the base and I thought it looked good. Styrene makes a big difference. I've used coffee stirrers in the past, but they certainly feel too thick at 1/72 scale. I used some cheap Euroshop grout to build up our snowbanks on each side of the road. Similarly to the mud, this was applied thick with a paintbrush on all of the remaining surfaces before being thinned in places with water to smooth out some of the transitions. While it was still wet, I pushed the fence into place, which makes it look as though it was there before the snow fell, and then I propped it up with a piece of spare plastic so that it would dry in the right position. Then I used some more spare strips to represent broken pieces of fence that might have broken or fallen off, maybe with the harsh winter conditions. I found some random bits of plants and trees, some from AK and some from Diorama Presepe, and then I used a metal tool to make a hole through the still wet grout to fix them in place. I used these to fill out our back corner behind the fence to create 3 distinct zones on this piece: the foreground of the empty snow, the middle ground, which is the road, and the background, which is our fenced off wild area. I added a few different types of plant here to add some visual interest. To complete our fence, I snipped our horizontal piece to be in line with the edge of the base, and then I continued adding plant life until I was happy with the diversity and overall impression of this background area. I used a hairdryer to kickstart the drying process on the mud, and especially our grout snow. This stuff takes a long time to dry fully, and I think it would have been best to just leave it be at this stage. I ended up with some cracks to fix, and I think they might have been caused by the hairdryer and my impatience. I used the foil from a tube of tomato paste and cut out a small rectangular shape to make our corrugated sheet. This stuff is great to represent thin metal like corrugate or flashing, and it's easy to bend with tools like tweezers into any shape desired. I alternated between forwards and backwards bends to create the distinctive pattern of corrugated metal before bending, cutting and damaging it until I was happy with the result. I tested a few positions on the ground, but I felt like it would need to be snow covered if it was there, so I ended up going with the reference from Hell Let Loose and used it to fill the gap in the fence instead. The final step before painting was to add card edges to the base to clean up the overall look and to fill any gaps around the edges to make it seamless. Onto painting, and although it may seem counterproductive, I decided to spray the whole scene black for one main reason. The snow and the mud are technically the right colours, but I want this scene to have a cold and bleak look, so by basing black I can desaturate layers to come and give myself more control of the overall colouring. I started by focusing on the shadowy details we've made, such as the fence and the plants. I want the plants especially to look extra bleak to give that middle of winter look. I was less concerned with the coverage of the deep areas of snow in the foreground. This will be our foreground, so I want it subtly brighter in the end to direct people's attention. The black was then quickly followed up by brown, sprayed in thin mottled coats over the muddy areas, the fence and the trees. I made sure the trees got a good coverage of this brown before adding some lighter orange tones into the airbrush cup to lighten them up more and give them a distinctly different base tone to our mud. Using what was left in the cup, I started to pick out certain leaves in this brighter tone, but this is a step we'll come back to shortly. In the meantime, I wanted to add a very cool snow tone, and one which would contrast with the yellow-based white of our Nashorn. So I decided to load up some light blue into the airbrush and sprayed it over some of our deeper snow deposits before adding a lot of white into the mix and catching more of the highlights. This is still not pure white at this stage. There was still some blue left in the airbrush cup, but I think it really evokes a very cold feeling and is going to separate our Nashorn from its environment in a very satisfying way. To finish our base coating stage, I grabbed some brushes and began to paint our details. I used a silver paint on the highlights of our corrugated sheet, front and back, before using more of the Army Painter rust effect that we used on our tracks to create a simple one-step suggestion of rust. As I said in that previous video, this stuff looks super vibrant when it's first applied, but if you trust the process and you let it dry, it leaves you with a much more believable effect. To paint our fence and to give it some character, I chose a range of blue shades and gave each plank a thin layer of varying tones. This instantly makes the fence look weathered and old, while still adding a splash of colour. At this point, I realised that our Nashorn didn't really sit into this mod as well as I had hoped, so I decided to add another layer of 8K's diorama paste to stick it in place, while also giving it the appearance of it sinking or sitting in the semi-frozen road. This did undo some of our nice work a little bit, but it was a necessary step for the realism of the final scene. I then decided to blend out the edges of the mud with water so that there was no clear line where the mud starts and the snow ends. Thankfully this paste dries darker than it goes on, and so it didn't look too out of place after the blast of the hairdryer. I used some white with a touch of blue to add back in some snowy, slushy deposits along the middle of the road while matching the tones of our previous work. Finally, I loaded some thinned pure white into the airbrush to pick out highlights before covering the road with a quick pass to give the impression of the most recent snowfall. Important here was to leave pure brown mud directly behind the tracks of the vehicle to make it look like it has just been disturbed by the Nashorn passing over it. At long last, it was time to add our figures to the scene. So I carefully snipped them off the casting block, roughly at first, before snipping smaller and smaller pieces of resin away from around their feet until we were left with just the figures. After testing their locations without glue, I squeezed out some black super glue and dipped their feet into it before securing them to the base. This was a bit of a scary task, but luckily I ran into no trouble here and was quite pleased with each of their locations and their posing. Now back to the step I mentioned earlier and picking out a few autumnal colours on our vegetation. The aim of this step is to break up the monotony of the vegetation while also adding some more colour to this wintry scene. As you can see, I simply spun around the base a few times, rotating through each of my tones and picking out leaves and prominent parts of our plants. When everything distinct has received a pass of colour, I used a larger brush to do a sort of dry brushing, catching the outer edges of the plants while leaving the centre nice and dark and shadowed. Finally, any prominent areas of trunk were given a highlight with a very light brown colour. And to blend them into our snowy scene, I used 8K's Snow Sprinkles effect and again did a sort of dry brushing so that it caught on some of the raised upwards facing areas and made our plants look at home. A little goes a long way here. Area by area, I painted matte Mod Podge over our snow before sprinkling a layer of snow microbloons. This is a super fine white powder which gives a really nice texture and bright colour to replicate fresh snow. I shake this on generously as I know I can shake off any that doesn't stick. After I do give it a shake, I give it a thin layer of white acrylic over the top to blend it all together and blow away any of the remaining loose powder. Really beginning to build up the effects at this stage. With the last few layers of airbrushed white and with powders, we've lost some of the definition and variety on our groundwork, so I thinned down some black and burnt umber oil paints and I painted it onto our track marks to show off some of the texture that we created in those early steps. Thinned even more for this step, almost entirely thinner now. I used oils to add some grime to the snow where our crew would have exited the vehicle or walked along the edge of the road with dirty boots. We can also use this to bring back some earth tones back into our icy road. Usually oils are extremely forgiving, but this is less the case here. As I'm sure you can see, the microbloons really soak up the oils and there's very little way to bring back our pure white if we go too far. I was careful in my application, and once I was happy, I put away the oils and I took out the black primer. Our base sides each got 2 coats of the black to ensure opacity, and then finally I used wet effects on the slush along our road, and I called it a day. And so that marks the end of our second project on the channel. If you missed them, this was the 4th video in this series on the Nashorn, so go back and watch those videos if this is your first view of the project. Otherwise, I would like to thank you again for watching, and I hope you picked something up from watching these, or at least that you enjoyed your time watching them. As always, feel free to leave a like if you enjoyed it, and let me know your thoughts on the final scene in the comments. Until then, I'll see you in the next one.